I paid for my brother's dream wedding, suit, venue, everything. Then discovered I wasn't even on the guest list. He declared, "You're too awkward, it'd ruin the vibe." So I made one call. The DJ, florist, and cake never appeared, but the silence at the ceremony did. I, 32M, discovered my brother's true feelings about me in the most humiliating way possible. After spending $60,000 on his dream wedding, I found out I wasn't even invited as a guest. The whole mess started 6 months ago when my younger brother came to me with tears in his eyes, explaining how his fiancée had always dreamed of a perfect wedding, but they couldn't afford it. He painted this picture of how devastated she was, how they'd have to settle for something small and disappointing. Being the successful older brother who'd built a decent software company, I felt responsible for helping family. I didn't just write a check. I got involved in every detail because I wanted it to be perfect for them. The venue alone cost $18,000. This gorgeous lakeside estate with panoramic views and century-old oak trees. The florist charged $8,000 for arrangements that looked like something from a fairy tale. The DJ was a premium guy who'd worked celebrity weddings, costing $4,000. The cake was a masterpiece from the city's most exclusive bakery, another $3,000. The photographer, the catering, the decorations, I covered everything. My brother seemed grateful during the planning process. He'd call me almost daily with updates, asking my opinion on colors and menu choices. I thought we were bonding over this project. I even took time off work to drive him to vendor appointments, treating it like the important family moment it should have been. 3 weeks before the wedding, I realized I hadn't received an invitation. When I casually mentioned it, my brother got uncomfortable and said they were still working on the guest list, that there were some complications with venue capacity. I didn't push it because I figured family was obviously included. 2 weeks before the wedding, I still hadn't received anything. I asked again, more directly this time. My brother stammered through some excuse about how they were doing a very intimate ceremony, just immediate family and closest friends. I reminded him that I was immediate family, his only sibling, the person who'd made this wedding possible. That's when he finally told me the truth. His fiancée thought I was too awkward and socially uncomfortable. She was worried I'd bring down the energy of their special day. My brother agreed with her assessment. He explained that I had this way of making conversations weird, that I didn't understand social cues, and that having me there would create tension for other guests. I sat in my car outside his apartment for 20 minutes after that conversation, processing what had just happened. My own brother had taken my money, my time, my effort, and then decided I wasn't good enough to witness the result. The wedding I'd made possible was too good for me to attend. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I started by calling the vendors. Not to cancel everything. That would have been too obvious and too cruel to the other family members who deserved to celebrate. Instead, I told each vendor that there had been a change in payment arrangements, that the person who'd originally hired them would now be handling all financial responsibilities directly. The florist was confused when I explained that my brother would need to pay the remaining balance before delivery. I'd already paid half as a deposit, but the other $4,000 was due on delivery day. She assured me that was standard procedure, and she'd collect from the groom that morning. The DJ had a similar arrangement. I'd paid half up front, and he'd expect the remaining $2,000 before he started setting up his equipment. When I told him the groom would handle final payment, he seemed fine with it. The cake designer was actually relieved when I explained the payment change. She'd been worried about getting stiffed by wedding clients before, so she was happy to hear the groom would pay the remaining $1,500 on delivery. I called the venue coordinator and explained that due to a family financial restructuring, my brother would now be responsible for all outstanding balances. The venue still needed $12,000 before the ceremony could proceed. She noted the change in her system and confirmed they'd speak with the groom about payment before allowing setup. The photographer was the easiest conversation. I simply told him that payment arrangements had changed and he'd need to collect his remaining fee from the groom before shooting. He thanked me for the heads up. None of these vendors seemed concerned about the payment switch. It happens often in weddings when family financial situations change. They had their contracts and they'd get paid, just by a different person than originally planned. What my brother didn't know was that I'd structured all the payments specifically to leave large balances due on the wedding day. I'd paid just enough to secure the services, but each vendor expected significant final payments before delivery. The wedding was on a Saturday in late spring. I spent that morning at home, doing normal weekend activities. I cleaned my apartment, went for a run, grabbed coffee at my usual spot. Around noon, my phone started ringing. The first call was from my brother, and his voice was already strained. He wanted to know if there had been some mistake with the vendor payments. The florist had arrived at the venue demanding $4,000 before she'd unload her truck. He couldn't understand why she was asking him for money when I'd already paid for everything. I explained calmly that I'd covered the deposit costs, but final payments were always the responsibility of the person who hired the services. I reminded him that he was the groom, that this was his wedding, and that vendors naturally expected him to handle final financial obligations. He became frustrated, saying he didn't have $4,000 available, that this wasn't what we discussed. I suggested he figure it out quickly since his ceremony was starting in a few hours. An hour later, he called again. The DJ had arrived and was also demanding payment before setting up. My brother was now panicking because he realized this wasn't just an issue with the florist. He asked if I could cover these final payments, and he'd pay me back later. I told him I'd already contributed more than enough to his wedding, and that it wasn't appropriate for me to handle every expense when I wasn't even invited to enjoy the celebration. He went quiet for a long moment when I said that. The third call came 20 minutes later. The bakery had arrived with the cake, but wouldn't release it without payment. The venue coordinator was also asking about the outstanding balance before they'd allow the ceremony setup to continue. My brother's voice was starting to crack as he realized the scope of the problem. He asked why I was doing this to him, why I was ruining his wedding day. I explained that I wasn't ruining anything. I was simply not paying for a party I wasn't invited to attend. I suggested he contact his fiancé's family or friends to help with the remaining costs, since they were the people whose opinions about the wedding actually mattered. By 3 o'clock, 2 hours before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, my brother called in complete desperation. None of the vendors would provide their services without payment. The florist had already left with all the arrangements. The DJ was packing up his equipment. The cake was sitting in a delivery truck that wouldn't be unloaded until someone paid the balance. The venue coordinator had informed all the arriving guests that there would be a delay while financial matters were resolved. Family members were standing around in their formal clothes, confused about why nothing was set up for the ceremony. My brother begged me to fix the situation. He promised he'd add me to the guest list, that there had been a misunderstanding, that of course I was welcome at his wedding. He said his fiancée would apologize personally and that they'd find a way to include me in the ceremony somehow. I listened to his promises and his panic, and then I explained something to him. I told him that the money wasn't really the issue. The issue was that he'd taken my generosity and decided I wasn't worthy of sharing in the joy it created. He'd looked at everything I'd provided and concluded that the person who made it possible wasn't good enough to be there. I asked him how it felt to watch his perfect wedding disappear, to see all those beautiful elements he'd been so excited about getting loaded back onto trucks and driven away. I wondered if he was experiencing even a fraction of the humiliation I'd felt when he told me I was too awkward for his special day. The final call came at 4:30. The ceremony had been officially postponed. Most of the guests had left after waiting around for 2 hours with no explanation beyond financial complications. The few remaining family members were trying to make sense of what had happened. My brother's voice was completely defeated as he told me the wedding was over. His fiancée was crying in the venue's bathroom. Her parents were furious about the embarrassment in front of their friends. The photographer had left after an hour of not getting paid. The caterers had started packing up their untouched food. He asked me one final time if there was any way to salvage the day, if I would reconsider helping them. I told him that ship had sailed when he decided I wasn't good enough to witness what my money had created. Update 1. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Within a week, the story of the failed wedding had spread through our entire extended family. My brother initially tried to paint me as the villain, telling people I'd sabotaged his wedding out of jealousy or spite. But when family members asked for details, the truth came out about why I wasn't invited. Our grandmother was particularly disgusted when she learned that I'd been excluded after paying for everything. She called my brother to express her disappointment, saying she'd raised us better than that. Several aunts and uncles reached out to me with support, saying they were proud of how I'd handled the disrespect. My brother's fiancée apparently became furious with him after the failed wedding, blaming him for the entire disaster. She felt he should have either included me from the beginning or found a way to pay for the wedding himself. Their relationship became strained as the reality of their financial situation set in. They'd been counting on wedding gifts to help with immediate expenses, but with no wedding, there were no gifts. They still had a lease on an expensive apartment they'd planned to afford with combined finances, but now they were facing the cost of a second wedding attempt with no help from family. The vendor deposits I'd paid were all forfeit according to the contracts, so that money was completely lost. If they wanted to rebook the same services, they'd have to start from scratch financially. The exclusive venue had a 2-year waiting list, so they'd lost their perfect location permanently. My brother tried calling me a few times during that first week, but I didn't answer. I wasn't interested in hearing apologies motivated by consequences rather than genuine remorse. He'd made his choice about my value to him, and I'd responded accordingly. Update 2. A month after the failed wedding, I heard through family that my brother and his fiancée had broken up. The stress of the financial disaster, combined with the family tensions and social embarrassment, had destroyed their relationship. She'd moved back in with her parents, and he'd had to find a smaller, cheaper apartment. My brother finally showed up at my office one afternoon, looking terrible. He'd lost weight and had dark circles under his eyes. He asked if we could talk, saying he needed to apologize properly for everything that had happened. I agreed to hear him out, but I made it clear that our relationship had fundamentally changed. He explained that his fiancée had pressured him about the guest list, that she'd convinced him I would make her family uncomfortable. He admitted he'd been weak and had chosen her opinions over family loyalty. He apologized for taking my generosity and then excluding me, saying he understood now how deeply he'd hurt me. He offered to pay back every penny I'd spent, even though we both knew he didn't have that kind of money. I told him the money wasn't the real issue, though I appreciated the offer. The real issue was that he'd shown me exactly how little he valued our relationship when it mattered most. He'd been willing to take everything I offered, but didn't think I was good enough to witness the result. I explained that trust, once broken this completely, couldn't be easily repaired. He'd have to live with the consequences of his choices, just like I'd had to live with the humiliation of his rejection. He cried during that conversation, saying he'd lost everything: his fiancée, his dream wedding, his relationship with me, and the respect of our family. I felt bad for him, but I also felt like these were natural consequences of his actions. Update 3. 6 months later, my brother had started dating someone new. I heard about it through our mother, who was cautiously optimistic that he'd learned from his mistakes. Apparently, he'd been completely honest with his new girlfriend about what had happened with the failed wedding, taking full responsibility for his poor judgment. The new girlfriend actually reached out to me through social media, saying she'd heard the whole story and wanted to meet the brother who'd taught such an important lesson about respect and family loyalty. She seemed to understand that my brother had needed to face consequences for his actions. I agreed to meet her, and I was impressed by her directness and maturity. She didn't make excuses for my brother's behavior, but explained that he'd grown significantly from the experience. She said he talked about our strained relationship as his biggest regret from that entire period. Through her encouragement, my brother and I started having occasional conversations. They were awkward at first, but gradually became more natural. He never tried to minimize what he'd done or rush the healing process. He seemed to understand that rebuilding trust would take time and consistent better behavior. A year later, when he and his new girlfriend got engaged, he called me immediately. He said he wanted to be completely transparent about wedding planning and hoped I'd be willing to play a significant role in the celebration. He assured me that I'd be honored as his brother and that my opinion would matter in all decisions. I told him I appreciated the gesture, but that I wouldn't be contributing financially to another wedding. He said he completely understood and that he and his fiancée were planning to pay for everything themselves, no matter how modest it needed to be. The wedding ended up being a small, simple ceremony in our childhood church with a reception at a local community center. It was nothing like the elaborate celebration I'd funded, but it was genuine and meaningful. My brother gave a speech during the reception specifically thanking me for teaching him about integrity and family values, even when the lesson was painful. I realized during that simple celebration that my brother had genuinely learned from his mistakes. He'd faced the consequences of his choices, lost everything he thought he wanted, and emerged as a better person. The revenge I'd taken had served its purpose, not just as punishment, but as education. Looking back, I don't regret my decision to let his dream wedding collapse. Sometimes people need to experience the full weight of their choices to understand their impact. My brother learned that you can't build happiness on a foundation of disrespect and exclusion. The silence at his original ceremony taught him more about family loyalty than any lecture could have. The simple wedding he eventually had was infinitely more meaningful than the elaborate one that never happened, precisely because it was built on honesty, respect, and genuine relationships rather than superficial appearances and social anxiety.